At this point, I'm beginning to sound like a doomsday prophet, but things just got worse. The war in Ukraine is taking a very dark turn. Russia is now on the brink of escalation because something big just happened. The Kremlin got targeted. According to Russia, two drones were used in an attack on the Kremlin. They went after Putin's residence in the citadel. Now, this is big. Because if this is true, it's basically an attempt to take down the Russian leader. Now, obviously, Ukraine is denying they had anything to do with it. Zelensky made a statement saying, "We don't attack Putin or Moscow, we fight on our territory." That is all fine and good. But at this point of the conflict, it doesn't really matter. Russia's likely going to retaliate in some form or another. And the world isn't ready for more chaos because Moscow is going to rain fire and brimstone down on Ukraine. It just isn't on the battlefield, guys. The war is being fought not just on land, but on the global economy as well. So if you think inflation is done and supply shocks are over, you might be in for a nasty surprise. Remember what we are seeing today. We have a banking collapse in the United States, inflation is still sky high, Europe is deindustrializing, and Japan is printing money like no tomorrow. And if Russia does what I think they're gonna do, there's no way a soft landing is possible. It's just not possible to dodge the coming recession. And do you know what sparked World War One? It was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, the leader of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was taken out by a Bosnian student on the way to a town hall meeting. And shortly after that, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and World War One broke out shortly after that. Sure, tensions were high, but all it takes is one wrong move and the entire world plunges into chaos. Right now, the Russia-Ukraine war is still in a sense contained. It's a tragic situation, but the hot war is still contained. But if the attempt on Putin succeeded, God knows how bad the situation will get. Sure, we know a lot of people in the West, they hate Putin, especially in Ukraine, I understand, but things could always get worse. And let's say the attack succeeded and Putin was taken out. We could get someone even more hawkish in charge of Russia, and then everything spirals out of control. And this is how bad things are getting. Russia's moving to script Victory Day parade amid the fear of Ukraine strikes. So this is already affecting the psyche of the top echelon in Moscow. Because Victory Day is a big deal. It's to commemorate Soviet victory over Hitler's Germany in World War II. It's a day that Putin goes to address the nation to show Russian military strength. But if they are scaling back the celebrations, this tells us that the attack was actually quite a big deal to the Russians. And if we listen to the West, there are outlets calling it a false flag or stage attack by the Russians. For what reason? To bring the war home to a domestic audience and set the context for wider mobilization. Now, Russia is of course blaming the United States for the drone attack. Was it behind it? Did they direct Ukraine to do the hit? And here's the truth, no one knows who did it yet. We can speculate all we like, but it really doesn't matter. The stage is set for things to really get worse. Maybe it'll be another mobilization or maybe even something worse. And this is where we need to talk about Russia's revenge. Because I'm quite certain Putin is going to take this lying down. He probably has something up his sleeve that we don't know yet. But let's talk about what's happening on the ground. We need to talk about both the ground battle and then the economic fight because they are all connected. Ukraine is planning a counter-offensive with the United States sending them an additional $300 million in military aid. But Russia isn't going to go quietly into the night. In fact, the Kremlin attack is just going to harden their resolve. We're going to understand that the battle for Bakhmut is also one big PR campaign for both sides. The G7, they need a victory there to show the world that their money and their weapon support is winning the day, right? Likewise, Russia also needs a victory, not just for the local people. It needs to show the rest of the BRICS bloc, especially China, that the Russians won't fold. So this is going to be a meat grinder where both sides will throw men and money into a black hole. And if you look at the headlines, it's very interesting because this is a tale of hedging. We have reports of Ukraine's counteroffensive approaching and Russia in disarray. Then we have articles like The Economist telling us Russia could take the city within a couple of weeks. But if Bakhmut falls to the Russians, there's a very good chance fighter jets might appear on the battlefield. Then all hell will break loose. And I think we mustn't underestimate the chance of this happening. We have gone from battle helmets to battle tanks within the last 12 months. It really isn't a stretch to imagine F-16s being shipped all the way to Ukraine. And I want us to focus on what Zelensky said about the counter-offensive. He has told the West that a counter-strike will happen despite having no F-16 fighter jets. So if the counter-offensive fails, the lack of jets will be an easy scapegoat. And that's why I believe Ukraine will get their planes if the push fails. And this means there'll be more cash being thrown into the black hole. And at this point, it doesn't really matter where the money comes from, right? Maybe it's from the Federal Reserve printing money or raising debt by issuing more bonds. It's still an inflation mess because the money supply increases and war is always unproductive. But let's shift gears and focus on the economic front. We know that the West has been bombarding Russia with sanctions, and a big byproduct is inflation. However, Russia still has their own cards to play. They still have a hand at the poker table, and their cards aren't just twos or threes. They can still affect the world economy. And I'm not sure about you, but the biggest pain I felt in 2022 was rising food prices. And I swear to God, prices were jumping by a minimum of 10 to 20% everywhere. Just take a look at the price of eggs, up from $2 a dozen before the war to over $4.80 at the peak. That's 140% inflation in just 10 months. And how about bread? Prices are still rising. It has gone from $1.60 pre-war to almost $2 a pound today. That's a 25% inflation in slightly over a year. What if Russia walks away from the Black Sea grain deal? What if the grain in Ukraine isn't allowed to be exported out? And there's a stalemate on extending the deal because Russia wants the sanctions to be dropped. But I don't think this is going to happen, especially after the Kremlin attack. Putin might just pull out of the deal. And before you say grain from Ukraine doesn't matter, it absolutely does. It is a breadbasket of the world. We can see a huge gap of grain exports missing for 5 months. It is near zero. It's no surprise that food prices globally exploded after that. Even today, the export levels aren't back to pre-war levels, which is very problematic. But if Russia walks away and the supply plunges back down to zero, food prices are gonna fly up. But let's go one further. Remember when the West froze Russian assets? Well, Russia is starting to do some seizures of their own. The Kremlin has taken control of Fortum and Uniper, energy companies still functioning in Russia. And according to the Kremlin, the main goal of the decree is to create a compensation fund for possible use in tit-for-tat measures in response to the seizure of Russian assets abroad. And after the drone incident, Russia could simply extend the seizure of Western assets. And the problem with this is the economic damage it will do to Western companies that will boomerang back on the world economy. Now, Uniper has booked a $4.4 billion loss on their Russian unit because they know they probably won't get it back. If more seizures happen, more write-downs will happen, and that will affect net income and push companies closer towards an earnings recession. And this is the problem with the world economy today. Everything is built on leverage controlled by low interest rates. And as rates go up, everything starts to destabilize. And let's war game this out, guys. If Russia decides to cut the food supply or restrict oil imports to the West, inflation starts to go up. And this is something many of us still don't understand. The West, especially Europe, is still getting Russian oil indirectly. Germany, France, and Italy, all these countries are still being powered by Putin's oil. They are just paying more for it. And here's a headline from Bloomberg that spells out the problem with restricting oil supply. And whether it's done by the West or Russia itself, the effects are still the same. Russian oil is still powering Europe's cars with the help of India. India is importing record amounts of Russian crude oil and now is Europe's top fuel supplier. And this is no coincidence. This means Russian oil is flowing to India and then being re-exported out to Europe at higher markups. If we can see a big rise in Russian oil imports from India from near zero to over 2 million barrels a day, and that's the yellow line. And notice the white bar. That's Europe's fuel imports from India. It is rising to compensate for the big drop-off in Russian fuels. So make no mistake, Europe is still getting their oil, but at higher prices. So if Russia cuts off the energy supply to the West or reduces production together with OPEC+, then we'll have a revived inflation crisis. And this circles us back to the Federal Reserve. The Fed just recently hiked interest rates by yet another 25 basis points despite all the chaos happening. Why? Because inflation is still a clear and present danger. And every time rates go higher, this is pushing the economy off a cliff. We need to understand this. And we know the banks are crashing. We are now at the fourth bank collapse in the United States. Silvergate, Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and now First Republic. And all these banks are victims of higher interest rates that wreck their balance sheet. And now we have yet another bank, PacWest, on the brink of collapse. So if Putin decides to ramp up the inflation pain, what do you think the Fed's gonna do? Powell's just gonna keep rates high or hike them even further. Then we'll have bank number 5, number 6, number 7 all collapsing around us. And before we dismiss it as just the bank's problem, it isn't. It affects you, it affects me. The effects of direct inflation are straightforward. We see higher prices, we get spooked out, so we spend less, consumers get squeezed. That part is very obvious. But the indirect effects are the bigger issue. It's all that pressure building under the surface. And this is why a wave of layoffs is coming. The tech layoffs in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley is just the tip of the iceberg. This ain't nothing yet. The calls for a credit crunch are getting louder. We have said for months that a credit crisis is coming thanks to higher rates, and it's now finally happening. The banks are terrified of loaning money. Consumers can't afford to take on debt as well, and businesses can't borrow money. This leverage economy is going to crumble if things continue. We have the Bank Society Generale saying a credit crunch could more than double the rate of US debt defaults, and this should be extremely concerning because there are just so many bubbles floating around that could pop, and each one of these bubbles has the potential to crash the economy. And I think the conversation about recession coming is understated. We are now going towards a stagflation, and that is the worst situation of them all. And that's when unemployment spikes and the economy contracts while inflation is still sky high. And the attack on the Kremlin could push Russia to unleash an inflation hell as vengeance. It could totally happen, it's not impossible. Back in June 2022, Putin made an important speech that just flew past everyone's heads. He said how the economy of imaginary wealth is being replaced by the economy of real and hard assets. And the plan was very simple. You generate sticky inflation by controlling the flow of commodities. These will force central banks in the West to hike interest rates, and this will cause pain to economies that have relied too long on cheap credits and low rates for decades. And this is what's exactly playing out in the banking sector. We are seeing collapses being triggered by higher rates, and it's really not that complex once you sit back and you think about it. And that's why this attack on the Kremlin is a big escalation point. If Russia moves to weaponize commodities even further, then we are in for another wave of inflation. And what I don't understand is the delusion of a soft landing still being talked about. Listen to this from the Financial Times. There's still a narrow path to an economic soft landing. Or how about this one from Reuters? US job openings report keeps some soft landing hopes alive. The disconnect between reality and hope has never been bigger. The longer the war drags on, the further we will be from a soft landing. So we have to prepare. And we need to ask ourselves some very important questions. Are we in a huge amount of debt? What if inflation spikes back up to 7, 8, or even 9%? Can you survive losing your job? Because at this rate, the battle will continue until both sides are drained of resources, manpower, money, and weapons. So let me know what you think. How bad will this escalate? What will be the next move? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe. This chaos isn't ending anytime soon.